What's up, everybody? Welcome to System Crafters. I'm David Wilson, and in this episode, we are going to take another step on the Emacs From Scratch series, and this time we'll be talking about LSP mode, and basically how to build your own IDE, or in other words, an integrated development environment like you might see in editors like Visual Studio Code or the JetBrains editors, etc. Let me turn down this volume just a little bit. So as usual, this is a live stream, so if you have any questions at any point through the live stream, please just feel free to put them in the live chat and I will try to address them. And I'd also like to acknowledge all the people who joined the Discord right before this stream started. I've been having a nice time chatting with a bunch of new folks in this Discord there. If you want to join the Discord to talk about Emacs or system configuration in general with a lot of nice people, check out the link in the description or over in the chat. I have a pinned chat message that has more information on that. All right, so the LSP mode is a package that allows you to easily bring more advanced code editing functionality into Emacs. And this was actually kind of a sore spot in Emacs for a very long time, because you have all these other environments like Visual Studio or other integrated development environments that have all this functionality, like doing code completions on function names, or being able to find definitions or references of particular symbols, or just any kind of language intelligence like that. So Emacs, you had to usually install very specific packages for different languages to get this functionality, and a lot of times it was very inconsistent between the different packages, and it wasn't really like a great experience for someone who was trying to come to Emacs because they heard really good things about it, but then they wanted to be able to use it for their job or for their projects they're working on, and then they found out that the experience editing that code is a lot less capable than in another editor they were using before. So LSP mode came along, I don't know, maybe in the last 2-3 years, and has totally changed all that. And we're going to talk about why, or basically how this happened. So basically, around the time the VS Code came out, there was this new idea of, well, I guess it wasn't that new. So there was an idea of having external processes that could provide language functionality to an editor. This actually wasn't first invented in VS Code. This was actually invented by someone who created a program, or at least as far as I know, a program called OmniSharp. OmniSharp was a language server for the C# programming language, and that language server got integrated into a variety of different editors to provide C# functionality, Emacs being one of them. And basically, it's just a process that an editor can start and communicate with to get language functionality for the files that you're editing. So whenever Visual Studio Code came along, they were trying to make a more minimal and integrated code editor that reminds people of, let's say, Sublime Text or Atom, etc. But they wanted to have that rich language editing functionality built into it. So the way they decided to do that was to take a page from the OmniSharp model and then make this sort of language server idea a standard. And this actually, in my opinion, is like one of the greatest gifts, I guess, that Visual Studio Code has brought to the programming sphere, is this language server protocol. And that's what LSP stands for. So language server protocol is basically a standard for an editor to communicate to some external process that knows a lot of things about a particular language, so that the editor can get some of that intelligence to display things to the user, like code completions or just general intelligence about the code itself. The protocol operates by launching a subprocess from the editor. So any editor that can launch a subprocess can start a language server, and then they communicate over the standard in, standard out input channel of the process, basically. And then they have a very specific structure of messages that use to communicate between the editor and the process. Language Server Protocol specifies quite a large list of messages for all the different features that an editor might want to provide. So each language server for a particular language, let's say TypeScript or Python, etc., they'll have different levels of implementation of these different messages. So basically, whenever you're using LSP mode with language servers, you may find that some language servers have more functionality than others, and that's just really just a matter of the particular language server not having the same level of features. But that's just something to keep an eye out for. So if you're interested in this idea of language servers and how the language server protocol works, you should definitely check out the language server protocol specifications. If you just search language server protocol on your favorite search engine, then usually that's the first thing that shows up. So you see the official page for language server protocol. And it just describes what the protocol is. You can go to the specification page and take a look at all the messages. As a person who wants to use LSP mode or a language server, you don't need to know all this, but if you are interested in how it works, you can go find out all about that here. So what we want to talk about today is how we can use this functionality of language servers in Emacs with LSP mode. So LSP mode is basically a package that is a client for language servers, and it has a lot of nice integration points so that you can have other packages that come in and add extra user interface elements or any kind of other behavior that you really need for your integrated development experience. And I titled this episode Build Your Own IDE with LSP mode because what I like about LSP mode is that it sort of has this minimal core that has some features that aren't necessarily turned on by default, or at least not visible by default. So it seems very minimal, but you can actually add more things to it to make it a little bit more effective for what you want to do. So in my opinion, that's a very nice way to do it. And we're going to see how to sort of build up from the basics to having something a little bit more rich as we go on. So I know that was a lot of preamble, but I thought it was interesting to have some background. I know that David J from the Discord was asking about that, so hopefully that gives some good background to it. Let's see. I'm checking the live chat right now. Marston is asking about setting up leader keys for major modes, like in Spacemacs. And I think that I covered that in the key bindings episode. I think it's episode 3. If you check that out, you should be able to see that there. Otherwise, if you want more info on that, I'd be happy to do a separate Emacs tips video on that. Cherry, hi Cherry. Hello, finally LSP. Yes, we are talking about LSP today. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So first of all, let's just go take a look at the documentation page for LSP mode, because it does have a lot of information about what features LSP mode has. So it's useful to go take a look at that. Now, I will say that this page does not render correctly in the browser that I use called VimB, so sometimes things are a little bit weird, but you should definitely check out this page. It basically gives you an overview of all the features, and the most important part is to go to the, one second, I'll go back up to the main menu here. The languages section, which I just kind of skipped past. Languages. So in the languages section, you can see that LSP mode supports a wide variety of languages, even languages like Ada, which I have not heard about since college. Basically, all of these languages listed here have language servers, and you can hook them up with LSP mode. So basically, any modern language or development tool that you're kind of interested in using, like let's say Haskell or Python or OCaml or Kotlin, etc. All these languages have language servers that can be hooked up into LSP mode. But just keep in mind that, like I told you before, different language servers have different levels of functionality. So some things that you see working in one language may not necessarily work in another, but generally, like the core functionality works across the board. I am so sorry. I just realized that I'm not showing my screen right now. Thank you, the Avo, for telling me that. So yes, as you can see now, I'm showing the page for the language server protocol support for Emacs, and all the languages are listed here in the menu. So basically, if you go to the page and click the menu here, you can see the languages that are supported by LSP mode. Thank you, the Avo 1990. So today, I am going to show how to set all this up using the TypeScript language, because I use the TypeScript language every day with LSP mode, so I'm very familiar with it. But I think what I'll do is, for specific languages, I may make separate Emacs tips videos for how to set those up, because each language has its own sort of setup, its own tooling and environment, and it's probably better to have dedicated videos for those. So after this video is over, if there's a particular language you'd like to see how to set up Emacs for with LSP mode, etc., in a very good way, leave it in the comments so that we can talk about it in a future video. All right, so let's go on to the initial configuration. So the very basic configuration for LSP mode is pretty simple. You're just basically pulling in the LSP mode package. I'm going to open up our Emacs From Scratch configuration. And if you don't know about that, we have a repo at github.com/davywild/emacs-from-scratch. If you go there, you'll see all the configuration that we've been working on so far. So I will go down. So now that we have, since episode 7, we have our configuration set up in an org mode file. I'm going to be doing this all in the org mode file for our config. I'm going to go down to the development section that I set up, and I am going to add a new section called languages. Whoops, I'm not sure why all of a sudden it's deciding to type that. Languages. Now I'll put also a language server. Language servers. And we will paste in this LSP mode configuration. So what we're doing here is we are installing the LSP mode package from Melpa. And we are setting it up so that the commands LSP and LSP deferred both will activate the package whenever they get called. I'll tell you what these do in a second. And also, one thing that's nice about LSP mode is that instead of sort of asking you to set up all of your own key bindings for the LSP mode features, they actually give you the way to set your own key map prefix, because I find that the default prefix, which is like the Windows key plus L, or the super key, I guess, if you're used to Linux, that sort of clashes with other key bindings I have. So I'm going to change it to Control-C-L. So anytime that we want to use a language or an LSP mode feature, we're going to hit Control-C-L, and then that will give us the sort of set of bindings for LSP mode. Also, since we use the which key package, which gives us these nice pop-ups anytime we have, let's see, Control-C. Basically, this gives us this nice pop-up with descriptions of what all the bindings do. If we turn on LSP mode's enable which key integration, it actually will give us descriptions about what all the keys do, which is more helpful whenever you're trying to figure out what functionality is available at any given moment. So I'm going to go ahead and run this, and let me turn on the global command log mode. Is it CLM, open command log buffer? All right, so now I'm going to run this code with Control-XE. And we are now installing LSP mode, and it seems to be done. And I'm just going to jump into a TypeScript file so that we can see what is happening. Oh, that's another good point to actually bring up. So for LSP mode, you have to be able to turn it on for a given language. And the best way to do that is usually with hooks. But you may not already have a package installed for the language that you need to use. So for some certain languages like C, C++, or Python, I think there are built-in packages for those modes. But the other languages that are like less common or sort of not really like in the Emacs sphere of things like TypeScript, etc., you'll have to install separate packages for. So I actually do need to do a little extra work on that to get TypeScript set up first. So let me go and grab that configuration as well. Here we go. So I am going to set up the TypeScript mode. I'm going to create a separate section for this in our configuration. So under languages, let me just move this language service over. And then I'm going to type TypeScript here, and then I'll do a new code block, and then put in the TypeScript mode section. Now, what this is doing is it's going to install TypeScript mode from Melpa. And this mode signifier in use package tells use package to create an auto, I forgot what it's called, an auto mode, basically for the .ts file extension. So anytime a file with the .ts extension is open, we're going to activate TypeScript mode in that buffer. So that's helpful for just sort of recognizing that we're editing TypeScript and then activating some of this functionality. We're also adding a hook for TypeScript mode to turn on LSP mode, but we're going to use LSP deferred instead, because sometimes whenever you're cycling through a list of files that are changing your buffer view, like with Ivy, if you have LSP set up on the hook, it will automatically turn on the language server every time you switch buffers, which can be a little bit annoying. So I think LSP deferred keeps it from doing that until you actually do open the buffer for real. So that's a good hook to have set up here. And we're also going to set the TypeScript indentation level to 2, because that's generally the standard in TypeScript or JavaScript. For some reason, it's 4 by default, and I have no idea why. Let me go ahead and just run this. And while that's installing, I'll check the chat. So let's see. Kevin says DAP mode says that the API is considered unstable until 1.0 release. Yeah, that's for the debugger, which is basically a companion to LSP mode, which is really cool. We'll talk about that in another video for sure. David says, while I did cover how to create a leader key in episode 3, I didn't really cover how to bind functions to that leader key. Gave one example. Okay, yeah, you're right. I probably didn't go into that in enough detail, so I can do another video on going into more detail on how that works. And Cherry says that they saw talk on Emacs Conf about LSP mode and DAP mode, and it works pretty well. Yeah, it's cool stuff. I mean, like, this is all stuff that's coming from the developments in VS Code, so all the stuff that's working there with language servers and debug adapters is sort of possible to use in Emacs now, which is kind of a great thing. All right, moving right along. I am going to open up a TypeScript file from a project I already have on this machine. It's actually something that I was working on in another series of streams before I started the Emacs streams here. So I'm trying to open this index.ts file, and it is taking a little bit of time. Okay, so I did just skip a step, actually. So what you do see right now is I opened up a TypeScript file, and it is saying that the language server was initialized successfully. However, it's not that easy. I made it look easy, but I actually forgot to tell you that you need to install the particular language server for the language that you want to use before you try to start LSP mode. In this case, we are going to use the JavaScript TypeScript language server by Thea IDE. If I go to that page, it tells me that I need to go to use npm from Node.js to install the TypeScript language server before I'm able to use that in LSP mode. So basically, for any language that you want to use, definitely go look at this list of languages and find out what language server you need to install. It may already be in the package repository for your Linux distribution, or there may be a package you can install on Windows or Mac OS. Or it may be in the package manager for your language. It may be there too. So like for Python, you can probably install the Python language server through PyPy. So you just have to keep that in mind before you try to use a language server. Make sure that you go install it the correct way first. So now that we actually have that running, we can start to look at some of the behavior there. Kevin asks, which website is this? This is the LSP mode documentation site. So if you search for Emacs LSP mode on your favorite search engine, it should show up as like one of the first entries. So if you go there, you can see the languages documentation in the menu. So I am going to scroll it down a little bit in this code, and sort of like the most core thing that you really want whenever you have language integration in an editor is that when you start typing, it should give you completions for things that are in either the current buffer or things that are sort of available in the global scope or in the platform itself. So now that we have LSP mode turned on, we can just go into one of these sections and start typing something like AUT. But okay, so nothing's happening. But the reason why is because we don't really have any default binding setup or configuration setup for doing automatic completions. So starting from the most basic thing here, what you could do is run completion at point, which is actually a built-in functionality of Emacs where there's a concept of just getting a completion for anything that's at any sort of point in the editor. And there are various different backends that plug into that for different things, like maybe eShell has a backend for it, or org-mode has a backend for it, or then LSP mode has its own backend for completion at point. So now, since we're in an LSP mode buffer, we are going to get completions when we run completion at point from LSP mode. And you can see here that we're getting a lot of different things that all have the AUT prefix that I typed in it. And I'm using my Control-J, Control-K keys to scroll through these. I believe that this UI that's showing up right now is coming from Ivy. Because we've installed Ivy mode, this completion at point is actually, the UI is being driven from Ivy. If you don't use Ivy, this may show up in a different way. It may actually show up in the mini buffer, so your mileage may vary there. But if I select one of these, like let's say auth URL, and hit tab, then you can see that it completes that to auth URL. If I press dot, and then do completion at point again, I get the methods that are under auth URL. So now we've already got like way better functionality than we had before, because without the LSP mode, we would just get no completions. We would have to type everything ourselves, remember everything ourselves. Spudleo says could be company mode. Yes, it could be company mode. We'll see that in a minute. So that's just basic completions. So what if we want to call a function? So if we type in trim and open the parentheses, we can see down here in the mini buffer that it actually tells us the function trim doesn't take any parameters and it returns a string. If we were to call something else, like let's say console.log, and hit the open parentheses, we can see that it takes a parameter called message and then some more optional parameters basically. And we can also see that message is bolded here, and we get a documentation string about what the function does. So we also see that this 1 out of 2 here tells us that there's actually more than one overload to this function, and you can use the Alt N and P characters or key bindings to cycle through those. So I can see now that we're in the second one that says log, and the only parameter is like a variable length parameter called data. So now we can actually see information about the functions we're trying to call, which is really helpful whenever you're trying to remember how to call something, or maybe you don't really understand the API very well yet and you're just trying to see like what you could pass into a function. It's very useful stuff there. And let's see, what else would I talk about that? Yes, so basically, like, that's 99% of the time, that's what you're going to be using inside of company mode, is completions and the signature help. The other things are, like, when you put your cursor over a symbol, it will give you the same kind of information. Basically, you can see in the mini buffer, it tells us about console.log and the parameters it takes. Other things, it might give you the type of something, like this saying this is a var console of type console. And another thing you can see is that when you put your cursor on a symbol that shows up more than once in the file, it will automatically highlight every instance of that within that file. So you can kind of get a good bird's eye view of where a particular symbol is being used in the file. All this information is actually coming from the TypeScript language server, and LSP mode is facilitating the interaction with the language server to get that information and bring it back to show it in the editor. So pretty powerful stuff. So next, we want to see something even more useful, which is finding definitions and references of symbols. So like we saw before here, we can see that this auth URL is used in 2 places here, but we can also run, I think it's LSP find references, which is bound to Control-C LGR. That's a little bit crazy, but I'll show you in a second how that works. So I'm gonna run that, and it just gives us another view of the same thing. However, the really important thing is that this can go across files inside of your project. So I have another class that I've defined in another file, let's say YouTube client. So if I find the actual usage of YouTube client here, and I run that same command, this time I'll use the key binding, Control-C, L. We can see here that G is go-to. I press G, and now we can see find definitions, find references. I want references, so I press R. And now it tells me that there are three different files where this YouTube client shows up. There's chatpolar.ts, there is index.ts where we currently are, and there's also the YouTube client class itself. So I could go to this usage of it inside of chatpolar by hitting enter on that line or clicking it. And then basically I've followed that reference. And then if you're using evil mode, the easy way to get back to where you came from, if you press Control-O, and that will call the evil jump backward command, and it will bring you back to the previous place where you were. I think that it may have just jumped me somewhere else, but I'm not exactly sure. So we can also do find definition, which is a very useful thing whenever you want to figure out how something has been defined, or like if you're using a class and you want to go look at the code for it and see like maybe what the implementation does, or even methods of a class. So let's see, we're using YouTube client and calling this get chat messages. So I'm going to use Control-C L G for go to, and then I want to find the definition. So I'm going to press G again, and this jumps me directly to the definition of get chat messages. And once again, this is all stuff that's coming from the language server. Basically, LSP mode knows where your cursor is in the file, and it sends a message to the language server saying, hey, I want to find the definition for whatever the thing is that's under this cursor location in the file. The language server knows how to parse the syntax tree of the file and say what symbol is at that location, and then it knows how to find where that thing is defined based on its own logic for how the language works. So LSP mode itself doesn't even know that this is a function. All it says is, here, is this location? Just tell me where the definition is for whatever this thing is here, and if there's not a definition, it just sort of ignores it. So it's pretty cool stuff. So also, you can do things that cause changes to the code. So you can rename symbols. So for instance, if I wanted to rename get chat messages, I could hit Control-C L, and then let's see, I think it's under the refactor menu. So I press R, and then R again for rename. So now it asks me in the mini buffer, rename get chat messages to let's say get chat messages for fun. And if I press enter, it renames the instance of it here, but if you find references again, you will actually see that it has changed it in the places where it was used too. So the language server knows how to find the references, so it can actually apply that change of the name to anywhere where the same symbol was being used. And it does it based on its understanding of the language, not just like a simple find and replace of text. It's actually like using your real sort of call graph and everything that, involved. So it knows that you're renaming the right thing rather than just doing a simple like regular expression-based find and replace, etc. So, like we've already found a lot of really cool stuff so far. Let's see what else we can find. So, diagnostics is a pretty obvious thing. Like usually whenever you have a language where you compile the code, you will see error messages if you did something wrong in the syntax. Well, you can get that information before compilation for pretty much any language using diagnostics. So I think in this file there may be some stuff. Let's see. We're gonna run the, I think it's all fly check in the beginning. So fly check is a built-in, I think it's fly check, or is it fly make? Fly make is probably the built-in one. Let me see, errors. LSP diagnostics, let's see. Interesting. Let me actually pull up the command bindings. It's Control-C-L, and does it go to? Control-C-L, help. Okay, let me actually see if I can figure that out again. Oh, fly make show diagnostics buffer. Fly make show diagnostics buffer. Okay, so this file doesn't seem to have anything, but I know that the index.ts file has stuff. So if I show that, now you can see there is a list of what they call diagnostics. Mainly that could be errors or warnings or just suggestions that come as a result of analyzing your code. So now we see there's like these 5 messages. Like one of them says that reject is declared, but the value is never read. So basically just gives you some helpful hints about your code. Or if you have syntax errors, like let's say I try to call a function, but I don't close the parenthesis, it will tell us that the argument expression is expected here. So as you type, you're getting up-to-date errors or warnings about your code, which is pretty helpful. You can also do things where whenever there is a marker or a diagnostic that has an associated action with it, like it basically says, here's the action you can take to fix this problem, you will get a little light bulb that shows up in the mode line. So I'm putting my cursor on this chat message resolve. You can see that it has this sort of little green underline on it. So when I put my cursor there, this light bulb shows up. And I can press Control-C-L for LSP mode, and then A for code actions, and then A for code actions again. And what it does is it applies the only action that is available for that line, which is basically to remove it because it says it's unused. So there are lots of different types of code actions that are going to be given to you for different languages, basically for things like maybe you can move this function to another file, or maybe you could reorder these lines, or there's all kinds of little helpful things that might show up here. So whenever you see this light bulb, you can usually just click it and it will do the thing for you. We'll see another thing in a little bit that will give you more details about what the actual code action is, so that you don't have to just like blindly click it and not know what it's going to do to you. Next, we can do code formatting. So this is another thing that is coming directly from the language server. So if I run LSP, let's see, format buffer, LSP format buffer, which has a very strange looking key binding, which is Control-C-L equal. If I run that, then it will reformat this file based on what it thinks is the right formatting, which in my case, I think this doesn't really look right. I'm not sure how it's deciding to do this, but generally it is asking the language server to reformat this file and give back the new contents to the editor. I think that usually there's a way to configure the formatting rules for these. It may be something that the language server needs configured in some certain way, or maybe it's something that has to be configured in Emacs. There are variables in some places where if you look for LSP format, you may see some formatting options for various languages, but I don't know exactly if those get used directly or what, but it's good to know at least that you can have automatic code formatting. But typically what you find is that there are better code formatting packages for different languages than what LSP provides. So you may have to do a little bit more looking if you want to have like a really good code formatter in Emacs for a particular language. Let me stop for 1 second and look at the chat. So Jean-Pierre asked, does LSP mode work transparently with Tramp? I believe it can. I don't know if it needs extra setup. I know for sure that you would need the language server installed on the remote machine. For those of you who don't know what Tramp is, I will cover this in another video, but basically Tramp is a way for Emacs to remotely access files and programs on a remote machine as if they're on your local machine. So it's not like using SSH where you SSH into a remote session on another computer. You're actually sort of like tunneling your Emacs session to things that are on another machine so that you're using your local Emacs environment to do actions on the remote machine, the files that are there, the processes that are there, etc. So that is a pretty nice feature that we will discuss another time. Thank you so much, Carol, for the $2.99 in the super chat. That is amazing. That is actually the first super chat I've ever received. So thank you very much for being the first person to send one of those. I appreciate it. So let's see. Now the next thing is actually pretty cool. This is the place where we start to get into some of the real UI enhancements where it starts to look more like an IDE that you might have seen before. So we're going to set up something called the header breadcrumb. And what it does is that it sets a little header line up at the top of each buffer that shows you sort of the hierarchy of where you are in the file. So basically like the file path and then also the symbols that are in the file. So the class you're in, the method you're in, etc. So I am going to copy over this configuration real quick. And in fact, I can just show you just by running it in this existing buffer. If I run lsp breadcrumb, so you can toggle this using a key binding, but I just ran it basically, and now you can see that we're in source server index.ts. This path is relative to the project path itself. Inside of authenticate client, if I put my cursor in this function, you can see we are in authenticate client, and we are, like, I guess, inside the scope of the OAuth client variable. Here we can see that we're next to the auth URL definition and inside of the scope definition. So it gives you this sort of hierarchical view of where you are in a file. And if you click on these, I believe it does jump you back to the things that are there. In fact, if you click on a folder, I believe it opens up Dired. So it can be useful for quickly navigating the things if you like clicking. I believe there's also hotkeys to jump to some of those things as well, but I have not used that very much. So now let's see if we can turn that on for every buffer that we open. So we are going to go back to our LSP mode config here, and I am going to paste in what I just copied. So what we need is a function that can turn this on every time we load up an LSP mode buffer. So I'm going to add a hook for LSP mode to call this EFS LSP mode setup function that I'm defining. I'm going to evaluate this real quick. And what this is doing is it's configuring what segments the header line breadcrumb should have. We're going to play with that a little bit in a sec. And also it is starting the header line breadcrumb mode by default for that buffer. So if I were to kill the buffer that I'm in here, this index.ts, or actually let's do another one because the chat poller doesn't actually have it visible currently. So if I hit Control-X-K and kill chatpoller.ts and I reopen it, so chatpoller.ts. Oh, I have not reevaluated the hook yet. So let me go back into the documentation. So whenever you add a hook to a package, you need to reevaluate the code so that it actually does get applied. So let me go back and do that one little task over again. We're going to kill chatpoller and we're going to reopen it now. Whoops, wrong buffer. Chatpoller. So now when we open this chatpoller, the hook fires and we get the breadcrumb by default. And since this file has a class in it, we can actually put our cursor inside of a method of the class, and we can see that we're in the chatpoller class and inside of the start polling method. So just more of that sort of code hierarchy coming to play in the UI here. Okay, so if anyone has questions on any of that stuff, just please ask it in the chat. But I'm gonna move along because I do have a lot more to cover, and I want to make sure I have enough time to cover most of it, if not all. So we were looking at completions before, and the UI for it was fine. I mean, it was useful, but it didn't look very good. Probably many of you who have used Emacs in the past have heard of company mode, which is basically a better UI for getting completions at a given point in a file. There were lots of company mode backends for different languages that would provide completions and whatnot. But now that LSP mode came along, basically company mode can just hook right into LSP mode and provide those things for you without having to use a different backend. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab this configuration and jump over to our Emacs config. And I'll just, oops, I think I may have lost my copy now. Let's go back and grab that one more time. And then I will drop down here and add an item for company mode. And I'll paste that in. So we are going to install the company package from Melpa, and I'm setting it to load after LSP mode because we don't really care for it to be loaded before then. In this config, we're only going to use company for LSP mode since we use Ivy for every other completion situation. We are also going to add a hook so that company mode gets loaded in prog mode. Actually, probably what I want to do is LSP mode in this. So anytime LSP mode gets loaded, we want to load company mode. And let's skip the rest of this for right now. I'll just evaluate this part of the config, and then we will progressively get to the other parts of it. All right, so now I have evaluated company mode, and I'll go back to index.ts, and since we're in this buffer already, I'm just gonna run company mode. And now if I were to go here and start typing cons, we automatically get completions now. So before we had to invoke completion at point on demand, but now as we're typing, company mode will automatically start getting completions for us. And we can still use Control-J, Control-K to iterate through the list. I think you can also use Alt-N and P, which is a pretty common key binding in Emacs. And you can also hit Tab. What Tab does is it cycles to the common, I guess basically just cycles through the entries, and then you can hit Enter to select which one you like that to continue with it. Personally, I don't like this default key binding setup because I'm used to hitting Tab to complete the whole thing in an editor so I can just keep moving. So I have some extra configuration here in case you are a similar type of person who is used to that. We have some bindings here that we can add to the company config to resolve this issue. So I'm gonna go and, I still have them here. So what we're doing basically is saying that in the company active map, which is activated whenever a company completion is active, we want to say that tab is going to run company complete selection. If you were to look at the company active map variable right now, it will tell you that tab is bound to company select next. So basically it's just cycling through. So we want to change that behavior to do company complete selection. If we use Control-HF to describe that function, it basically says insert the selected candidate. So we're also going to say that in LSP mode, in the key map for LSP mode, we also want to bind tab to run company indent or complete common, because oftentimes in IDEs that you might be used to, if you start at the beginning of a line and hit tab, you would start getting completions, but here we don't. So we need to add a binding for that. Another couple things we'll do is to customize the settings for how completions are raised so that when you start typing, they immediately come up without waiting at all, so you don't have to wait like a half a second or something. So you can basically say that the minimum prefix length, meaning the number of letters you need to type for the completions to show up, is just 1, and then the idle delay is 0. So basically, like, as soon as I type 1 letter, just give me completions. So that can help speed things up for you a little bit. So if I go back to our config and run this whole block, then I should be able to go back into our index.ts buffer and type C, and then it gives us completions for anything starting with C. And if I go down to capture events and hit tab, then it will complete that. If I hit dot, it gives me anything under that, hit tab, and then you just basically keep going. So in my opinion, that is a very quick way to get code completions. It's much faster than the default setup. I mean, you could do the same thing with completion at point, but I feel like this is a generally better interface for it. So if you want to go even further, there is another package you can install called Company Box, which improves the interface. It's basically just an aesthetic thing, but I think that it makes it look a little bit nicer and makes some things stand out a little bit better. So we're going to drop this config in. We're installing the package Company Box from Melpa, and anytime that company mode starts, we want to start Company Box mode. So we're just adding a hook for that. So let me go and install that. And now I'm going to jump back. Let me know if I'm moving too fast. I know I'm moving a little bit fast here. I'm going to jump back into our file, and I'm going to type C. And now, let's see. I think our scroll bar looks a little bit different. We're missing some icons, so I think that might come in with a different package. But Alex says, nobody break chat rules. I have a meeting. Alex is our friendly moderator here. So clear timeout, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we're missing some icons. So one nice thing about Company Box is that it can show icons for you. And I believe if I install a different package, they may get installed with it. So that's just another nice thing to have. It doesn't hurt to have it. It actually just makes the things look a little bit smoother. So I think it's a good thing to have. So let's move on. So there is a whole subsection of UI enhancements you can install for LSP mode that come from the LSP UI package. And this is actually something that comes from the LSP mode project. So if you go to its homepage, it gives you a lot of details about the things that you can add and the ways to configure them. But I'm going to show you some examples of a couple of those things now. So what we're going to do is just copy this LSP UI config and drop it over into our Emacs configuration file. Let me find my LSP mode. There we are. Not that one, this one. Okay, so I'm gonna paste it right here under my LSP mode configuration. And I'm gonna run that now to install it. Okay, so now if I go back to my TypeScript file and I run LSP UI mode, it's gonna add some extra things to the UI. And what happens is that if I move my cursor around, I think that some things will start happening here. Like, let's say if I go back down to the line where, yes, if I go down to the line where there is a code action, you actually see over on the right-hand side of the buffer, there is a little helpful pop-up here saying, removed unused declaration for chat message resolved. So anytime you put your cursor on a line where there's something interesting to call out, you will get something over in the right side of the buffer. And I believe there is configuration for that. If you type LSP UI sideline, there are a variety of things that you can turn on or off here, like showing diagnostics, showing help, etc., that can give you information. One thing I do find, though, is that whenever you have a buffer width that's kind of narrow, things get jammed up together with the code, and it starts to get a little bit distracting. So I tend to allow only minimal information there, if at all. You can toggle this on and off using Control-C-L. I think it's capital T for toggle, and then there is toggle sideline, etc. So basically, a lot of the stuff you can turn on and off in this toggle menu. Yeah, the sideline stuff is a little bit reminiscent of VS Code for sure. So that was sidelines. You can also get a nice documentation frame for things. So if I were to put my cursor on, let's see, something that does have documentation. So I think I have read file sync. So when I put my cursor on read file sync, I actually get a documentation pop up here that gives me the full documentation for this function. Now, for me, having it pop up here in the top right corner kind of gets in the way of what I'm looking at. So you can actually change the positioning of that pretty easily. I'm going to use this LSP UI doc position in my configuration for LSP UI. So config, and I'll drop that in here. This may actually be a custom variable. Let's see. I'm going to go Control-H-F to look this up. LSP, no, Control-H-V, sorry. And it says this is a def custom, so I'm going to put this in the custom section instead. So here I'm going to say LSP UI doc position bottom, and I'll fix the parentheses, and I'll run this now. So now if I go back to the index.ts buffer and put my cursor on this, now you can see the doc shows up at the bottom, which is helpful. Excuse me. And you can also put the cursor into this frame by running LSP UI doc frame, focus frame. So if you do that, your cursor will go down into that frame so that you can move around, you can scroll, you can copy text, etc. So if there's like a code example that's inside the frame that you want to grab to put into your code, you can easily do that. And I think if you press Q, you may have to be in insert mode in evil mode. Or if you just run the LSP UI doc unfocused frame function, it will jump back out again. So that can be helpful. We talked about sideline already. Peek references is kind of an interesting thing. So if you want to see the references for a given symbol, but you don't actually want to have a list of files show up and then like jump to those files individually, you can have it actually show up inside of this buffer. If you've ever used VS Code before, you've probably seen something like this before. So let me put my cursor on chat polar here, and I'm going to run LSP UI peek references, peek find references. Okay. If I run that, then I get, oh, okay. So in this case, it didn't like that. So let me try this one more time. Okay, so for chat polar, oh wow, I moved my mouse and it disappeared. So now we have this little nested view where it says on the right side what the references are, and on the left side it gives us a little snippet of the code where that reference is. And if I use Alt-N and P, I can scroll through those references and see where those are. So if you don't want to have to open another buffer, this can be a way to really quickly get that information without having to go there. I personally don't use it very often. I just use find references as usual, because when you do that, it opens up a separate buffer that stays open. So LSP find references. And that can be more helpful if you're trying to investigate a problem and you want to kind of like go to all the locations, but not have to keep popping this peek thing back open again. So that could be a better usage pattern for you if you like that kind of thing. Okay, so let me see if there's any other messages here. Yeah. So Marcin is joking, saying that at first he thought that Alex was a flatmate, and then realized he was just has a chat open on the side monitor. Yeah, I'm looking at the chat on my side monitor here. Yeah. So I think we're caught up there. So one last couple of things since we're running out of time here. We're gonna look at LSP Treemacs, which is actually a pretty cool package. So if you don't know about Treemacs, let's look that up real fast. Treemacs is a package that can give you a sort of a tree view in the side of your screen for the file system. And a lot of people like to use that to bring up a sort of UI, sort of like in other editors like VS Code or Atom, etc., where you want to have sort of your files on the side and you can go jump to those pretty easily. lsp-mode has an extra integration with that, which will give you the symbols of the file also, so you can see the files and also the symbols for your project right next to each other, which is pretty cool. So let's go pull that up in our config real fast. I'll just drop it in right here for the sake of convenience. So let's just push that over a little bit, and then I'll evaluate it. So once that's done, I think it's done. Okay, it's taking a little bit of time here. Let's just wait and see what it does. Okay. There we go. All right, so I had a few things to install. We'll go back into this buffer, and I am going to run LSP Treemacs symbols. So when I run that, we're going to get this view that actually tells us the symbols of this file in a hierarchical fashion. So it says we have a method called authenticate client. We have auth key promise, and if I go and click on any of these, it will jump, or actually if I press enter, it's actually not giving me a focus in there, so maybe, okay, there we go. It took a moment for it to wake up. So if I click on any of these, it will jump to that location in the file. I think maybe my language server is slow at the moment. Sometimes we do have problems with language servers. They eat up a lot of CPU, etc. So this just gives you a really nice overview of what's in your file. If you go to another file, let's say if I go to chat polar, it updates, it basically follows where you go. So this, you can just keep this view open and it will give you an overview of any file you're in. You can also run Treemacs itself, and that will ask you which project root to open. I'm just gonna tell it to open up my main project folder. So now I can have a view, sort of like what you see in VS Code, where you can hit tab on a folder to expand the folder, and you can press enter on any file to go to that file. Basically, you just keep these two panes open the whole time, and it's almost like using a normal IDE that you're used to, because you have everything visible at the same time. I also believe that if you go to another file, the Treemacs will select that file in the view, so it follows you where you go, just like the other Treemacs does. Personally, I don't use this very much, but I think it's pretty cool for people who are used to that type of interaction mode. One thing you may notice is that these line numbers are showing up here. If you remember, I don't remember which episode it was, but we had, I think maybe the first episode. So if we say display line numbers mode, if we go to this view, or sorry, this configuration here, where we're basically turning that off for particular modes, we can turn that off for Treemacs mode. And I think that should fix the problem here. So if I run, oh no, it needs to be the mode hook, I'm sorry. So if I run this code, you have to close out your Treemacs buffers completely, I think, before this works. But if I run Treemacs again, let me kill the buffer, because I think it keeps some knowledge around. Yeah, so if I run Treemacs again, now the line numbers are gone. So that's just a way that you can get rid of those line numbers in that buffer if you do not want them. So yeah, that's Treemacs. And there is one last little thing. Since we use Ivy, there's a package called LSP Ivy. which it's not necessarily the most helpful thing in the world, but it's something that can be helpful to you sometimes. Basically, it gives you a way to quickly navigate the references of a particular symbol inside of your project. So I think I just ran that. And now if I go back to my index.ts and run, is Ivy LSP or, yes, LSP Ivy. Ivy workspace symbol. So now it gives me a prompt at the bottom, and I could type something like chat and press enter. Or, okay, I'm sorry. It did eventually get the thing. So I type chat and just give it a second. It will search for all symbols with the name chat in it. And then you can press enter on one of them and it will jump right to it. So if you know the name of a class or a function or anything inside of your project and you want to just jump right to that without having to search for it, then LSP Ivy is a nice thing that can help you with that. So let's see. I think that's everything I wanted to cover LSP mode wise. So let me just check the chat one more time for some more questions. So let's see. Carol asks, so I need to change NeoVim to Emacs. Well, it just really depends. I mean, NeoVim does have language server mode support as well. I think it may be an external package. I don't know if it's built in by default, but I mean, the beauty of language servers is that this same functionality is available to any editor so long as the editor has a proper client for it and can display or enable these features. So it's not necessarily something special to Emacs. However, if you want to be in Emacs, if Emacs is a place to be for you, then LSP mode makes it so that you can do your day-to-day work on projects here just as you would in any other editor. So it's really sort of frees you from having to use some other editor to do all this stuff. Let's see. Marston asks, am I supposed to install additional support for LSP with eLisp? I don't know if there's a language server for eLisp because the built-in support for eLisp is pretty good in Emacs. I believe if you go into, like, let's say if we go into init.el, and if you were to use, I will say on set face attribute, I think if you use xref references, find references, then it will find references for you. So Emacs has kind of its own built-in language functionality for eLisp, so you don't necessarily need a language server for that. There may be a language server for Emacs Lisp, but I kind of doubt it because it's not really necessary. Rodrigo asks, can the LSP server cache this stuff so it's faster? I think they can, but it's on a case-by-case basis. The server has to implement some kind of caching. I believe that typically the native language servers, like for C, C++, often do some kind of caching because it's more costly to get that information, but I could be wrong on that. Carol asks how to have the same config on Mac, Windows, and Linux. Is there some nice way to have one config? I do that. Basically, you just have to add some extra checks inside of your configuration to check which system you're on. So if you want to see what I do, I wrote a macro for this, which is actually not necessarily the best way to do it, but I did it because I wanted to learn how to write Emacs Lisp macros. But basically, I created a macro called onPlatformDo, and I use it for font settings only, really, right now. But yeah, onPlatformDo. If it's a Windows or Cygwin, set the face attribute to one thing. If it's on OS X, do another font. If it's Linux, do another font. So you can definitely have one file that you can use to check for different OSs and do different things. And generally the way that you do that is to check the, what is it called? System type variable, Control HV system type. It will tell you what the system is. So there's a list of values here for Windows, Darwin, which is Mac OS, and GNU Linux, etc. So that's one way to do system or OS specific behavior in your same config file. Yeah, Marston says, no need to use separate stuff for eLisp and everything else. GNU is a special child. Well, yeah, I mean, the native language of Emacs does have special features, I guess you could say. So let's see. There was a couple small little things. I can show you that, you know, this is not a lie. It does work for other languages. I can show you how this works for the C programming language really quickly. So I have a project I've been working on, which is basically a Lisp compiler that I'm writing in C. And I'm gonna go load up one of the files here. And I'm gonna run LSP. I haven't set up LSP mode for this, but I do have the language server CCLS installed already. So if I run LSP here, it's gonna ask me what my project root is, which is the current folder. So now it's started up the language server, and if I put my cursor on one of the symbols here, it will tell me that this is a function called const_char. It's in the mini buffer, but it's not actually keeping the information there. And I can find references of that function with, let's go, I think Treemacs has a nice view for that. Treemacs references. So here, I can pop open this tree of references of const_char. They're all inside of eval.c, but I can go navigate through all those. I think, let's see, if I go to one of my types, so if I go to, let's see, types.h, and I want to say, where are all the places that string value shows up? I'll run Treemacs references again. Oh, okay, I need to run lsp-mode here, and then do it one more time. So if I run LSP Treemacs references, I can see that across these two files, string value is used in both eval.c and types.h, and I can find all the locations of that and then hit enter to navigate to them. So even for languages like C, you have language server functionality, and you can get a lot of value out of that. I mean, it makes it a lot easier to write code in any language that has a language server. So I think that's a really nice thing to have. So one last little sort of bonus thing, which is not necessarily such a special thing, but it's something that can be helpful to you. Oftentimes you need to comment lines, add a like select some text and comment it. There is some built-in functionality in Emacs for that. However, I find that it doesn't necessarily do what I expect it to do some of the time. So I'm just going to add a section here, commenting. And we're going to use this evil nerd commenter package from Melpa. And I've bound it to alt/, I think that's / if I know my slash characters correctly. So if I go back into index, or let's go to eval.c. If I select a few lines and hit alt/, it will comment those out contextually based on what the language is. So it knows what comment characters use for each language. I can select some of those lines and hit alt/ to uncomment again. I can basically do it on an individual line without making any selection. That could be kind of helpful. And also for things like at the end of a line, you can select them and hit alt/ to comment some subsection of the line. So if you're used to hitting something like alt/ in an editor, this can be really useful. By default in Emacs, there is I think it's alt semicolon, but the behavior of that is not really predictable. Like, it actually added the comment at the end of the line here. There's probably another key binding I need to use to make it comment the whole line. Yeah, the whole line, if you select the whole line and do alt semicolon, it does that. But I find that the evil nerd commenter is a little bit more friendly for my cases, and you don't have to be using evil mode to use it. It works for any mode. Let's see. So I think that's it for the topics I wanted to cover. Let's see. Marco asks, I don't know Tramp. Is it Emacs specific? Yes, Tramp is Emacs specific. It's a feature of Emacs. We will definitely get into that in another video. So Spudleo says, in C, do you use an old school makefile? Was it hard to teach the C language server how to build your program? It is able to figure it out on its own for the most part. There may need to be some extra configuration that you need to add to make the language server pick up things correctly. In my particular project, I have a pretty simple code base, so it didn't really need much help. But yeah, definitely I would think that there may be some extra stuff that's needed if you have a more complex project for C or C++. So it really is language dependent on that. Some languages do have nice like project files that list all the files or dependencies in a project, and then the language server can use that to get all the info. But for C++, makefiles are not very parsable or understandable. You would have to run the compiler. So I think that CCLS uses LLVM as a backend and somehow is able to figure all that stuff out by itself. So that's one thing to know there. Marston asks, do I visit any IRC channels or servers? I occasionally go to irc.freenode.net to the Emacs and the Geeks channels there, but I don't really open it very often. However, it's a nice chance to plug the Discord server I just started up for System Crafters. If you check out the link in the description or in the chat there, we have a nice little group of people who are chatting about basically the topics in these videos, you know, Emacs or Geeks, etc. So if you want to chat about stuff related to this, please do feel free to stop by there. It's a very nice, friendly place. Let's see. So the next things that we're going to do, we're going to do individual videos for the remaining topics that I want to cover. So people have mentioned in the chat a little bit on DAP mode, DAP mode for debug adapter protocol. This is basically the same thing as LSP mode, but for debugging. So you can hook up debuggers for different languages inside of Emacs using that, which is pretty cool. We'll do a separate video to show how to use that because it's a little bit more complicated to configure because you have to tell it how to run your program and attach to it, etc. So it does take a little bit of extra work. There's also YA snippet or YA snippet. I don't really know how people pronounce that, but it's a helpful package for using snippets in code. So if you really like to have like some snippet for a common code structure you use, you can set up a snippet for that in your configuration to have it everywhere. Pretty useful. Also, lsp-mode has an integration with that, so it can use that to do snippets from the language server, which is pretty nice. Running compilers and unit test tools. There are ways in Emacs to run compilers and get information back, but we really didn't have time to cover that. And also, I really want to do language-specific videos. So if there's a particular language that you want to work with in Emacs and you don't know how to set up the development environment for it correctly, please leave a note in the comments so that I can do a standalone video for that, because I think that it would take standalone videos for many of the languages to really give it the right level of coverage. Let's see. S4 Writer says, is there any integration with REPLs? I think that's on a case-to-case basis with lsp-mode. The language server that I wrote back whenever language servers were just coming about for PowerShell, it does have an integrated REPL that is hooked in with the language server, but that's only for PowerShell. There may be other ones too. Python may actually work. And someone else asked me earlier if I preferred a particular Python language server, but I didn't answer that one. I don't do much Python development. I think I installed the Microsoft one before and it worked for me, but I don't really know if which one is really the best. So that really, someone else would have to tell me that. So if you have used Python language servers in the past, leave a note in the comments to tell us what you think is the best one, because I don't really have as much experience on that. And Spudleo says that people would really appreciate a Python LSP mode talk. Yeah, there are many options for Python, and Python is a pretty popular language, so I'm definitely going to cover that at some point in the near future. Okay, so that was a lot of talking. I hope that was useful for you. I think that we're finally reaching the point now where our configuration that we've been working on is rich and powerful enough to be useful on a day-to-day basis for people. So in the Emacs From Scratch series, I think there's probably 2 videos left that I want to do. One on using terminals in Emacs, and another for doing basically file management in Emacs with DRED and other things like that. And then after that, I want to get started on using Emacs as a desktop environment. So I've also started a sort of companion series, which I've alluded to a couple times, which is called Emacs Tips, which I'm going to do streams for during the week. I don't really have a specific day for that yet, but it's probably going to be Tuesday or Wednesdays. Yes, V-term, I'll be talking about Spudleo. So definitely keep an eye out for those two, because they're going to have like those individual topics I was talking about that we can't really cover in these streams. So we're going to keep on going with the Emacs videos. We're not stopping anytime soon, so definitely keep coming back. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell if you want to see those things, because there's so much to talk about in Emacs. We could talk for, I don't know, another year probably. So let's see, what else do we want to say? So also there's the Twitter account. And I think that my key binding is not working for that these days. But basically, if you want to follow us on Twitter, I'm trying to do some Emacs tips and stuff there pretty regularly every day or so. You can go follow me on Twitter at @systemcrafters, just like the name of this channel. And then we also want to thank the sponsors for the channel. So since the last few streams, I have gained a few more sponsors. I just want to say I really appreciate the people who have signed up to sponsor the channel and the effort that I'm doing here for making these videos. Basically, people who sponsor the channel are kind of helping me to get closer to that dream I have of being able to do stuff like this full time and not have to have a regular full-time job. So any help there is definitely appreciated. So we're up to 5 sponsors now. One of them is not listed because he asked to remain nameless, but I really appreciate the people who have signed up so far. If you are interested in sponsoring the channel, you can go to github.com/sponsor/DavidWill, or you could also do like donations and super chat during the live stream, etc. So just whatever makes most sense to you. But obviously this content is free, so you don't have to do anything if you don't want to. All right, so thanks again, everyone, for showing up today. I really appreciate all the interaction and the questions. This is definitely the most lively stream I've had so far, and it was really great. So I really appreciate all the comments and interactivity. After I get done with the stream, I will commit all this code to the Emacs From Scratch repo. It may take a couple hours before I get that up there, but you will be able to clone that and play with it and try it for yourself. So anyway, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you next week for probably 1 or 2 streams. So definitely subscribe and keep a lookout for that. And thanks a lot, everybody, and happy hacking. We'll see you the next time.